The auctioneer's chant was a death rattle for the Henderson farm. It was a rhythmic, hypnotic cadence that sliced through the crisp October air of 1976, each word a hammer blow, driving another nail into the coffin of 100 years of family history. I stood at the back of the crowd, my arms crossed tight against my chest, the worn flannel of my shirt a poor defense against the chill that had nothing to do with the weather. My name is Jedediah Miller, and I was watching my neighbor, Frank Henderson, get erased from the county map. And a 5. Now 6. Do I hear $600? 600 on the drill, a fine international 510. Barely seen 1,000 acres, boys. Who'll give me 6? The auctioneer, a slick man named Peterson from the city, pointed a fat finger into the crowd. Clayton Vance raised a single manicured finger. He didn't even have to look. He was leaning against the fender of his brand-new Lincoln Continental, a machine as out of place here as a tuxedo at a hog slopping. His boots were clean. His jeans had a store-bought crease, and his smile was the kind that made you want to check if your wallet was still there. 600 to Mr. Vance. Now 650. Can I get 650? Silence. The local boys, men I'd known my whole life, just shuffled their feet in the dust. They were here to pick at the bones, hoping for a cheap hay rake or a set of post-hole diggers. They couldn't compete with Vance. They couldn't compete with the bank that stood behind him like a silent, iron-clad partner. Frank Henderson stood beside his wife, looking like a hollowed-out gourd. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond his fields, the same fields his grandfather had broken with a team of mules. Every time the gavel fell, he flinched, another piece of his life sold off to the highest bidder. Vance bought the drill. Then he bought the planter, the disc, the cultipacker. He bought Frank's John Deere 4430, its green paint still glossy, the cab windows spotless. It was a 1974 model, bought on the promise of $5 corn that had never quite stayed. Vance walked over to it, climbed into the cab, and fired it up. The clean, sharp roar of that 6-cylinder diesel was an insult. He revved it once, a plume of black smoke puffing from the chrome stack, a victory salute. I felt a knot tighten in my gut. My own place, the quarter section my father left me, was paid for. My equipment was old, but it was mine. A 1951 Farmall M that Dad bought new, its red paint faded to a dull orange, and a John Deere 720 diesel that was my workhorse. They were simple, tough machines. No cabs, no air conditioning, no radio, just iron, grease, and honest power. I knew every bolt, every fluid leak, every quirk in their mechanical souls. They didn't owe a dime to any man in a suit. Vance was the new breed. He'd started a few years back, inheriting a decent spread and leveraging it to the hilt. The Production Credit Association loved him. He was their poster boy for an aggressive expansion. He farmed with a checkbook, trading in tractors every 2 years, buying the biggest, the newest, the best. His fields were immaculate, his yields were high, and his debt was a mountain hidden behind a wall of shiny new steel. He called men like me dinosaurs. "You can't make money with junk, Jed," he'd told me once at the co-op, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The future is horsepower and volume." The auction moved on to the land itself, 320 acres of prime bottomland. The auctioneer started the bidding high. It climbed fast. The local farmers dropped out quickly, shaking their heads. It was Vance against a couple of out-of-state investors on the phone, but Vance was here, on the ground, and he wouldn't be denied. The price per acre climbed to a number that made my teeth ache, a number that could never be paid back with corn and beans, not unless the good Lord guaranteed perfect rain and miracle prices for the next 30 years. The gavel fell one last time. "Sold to Mr. Clayton Vance." a polite, predatory smatter of applause. Vance gave a magnanimous nod, as if he'd just won a prize instead of kicking a man off his heritage. He walked over to Frank, shook his limp hand, and said something I couldn't hear. Probably some empty platitude about tough business and new opportunities. Frank just nodded, his face as grey as the November sky. I turned to leave. I'd seen enough. My boots crunched on the gravel driveway, the same driveway I'd walked down 1,000 times to help Frank with chores or share a cold beer after a long day of bailing. "Miller, hold up a second." Vance's voice. I stopped but didn't turn around. I heard his clean boots on the gravel behind me. "That was a shame about Frank," he said, coming to stand beside me. He smelled of expensive cologne. But he didn't adapt, tried to run a modern farm with 10-year-old ideas. I looked at him then. His face was smooth, confident. He thought he was explaining the world to me. "Frank's a good farmer," I said, my voice low. "He was a good farmer," Vance corrected. "This is a new game now. Go big or go home. The bank understands that. You should come talk to them, Jed. That little patch of yours. You could trade in that old junk, get a new 40630, maybe pick up another 80 acres. They're practically giving money away right now." "My junk is paid for," I said, "and my land." Vance laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Paid for doesn't pay the bills. You're sitting on a gold mine and trying to dig it with a teaspoon. I'm just telling you, the train is leaving the station. You're either on it, or you're under it." He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture of false friendship that made my skin crawl. "Think about it," he said, and walked back toward his Lincoln, the new king of Henderson land. I stood there for a long time, watching the crowd disperse, watching the tow trucks and flatbeds arrive to haul away the pieces of Frank's life. "The train is leaving the station," his words echoed in my head. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was a fool, a relic. But as I looked at my calloused hands, hands that knew the feel of a wrench and the ache of a long day's work, I knew one thing. If I was going down, it wasn't going to be some banker in a tie who signed my death warrant. It would be on my own terms, with my own iron. But before we go any further into this story, I have to ask you something. As you listen to this, think about the men you've known in your own life. The ones who run on debt and flash, and the ones who run on grit and what's paid for. Who do you put your money on in the long run? Let me know what you think in the comments below, because the answer to that question is the heart of this whole thing. The winter of '76 was a cold one, and it gave me too much time to think. Vance's words gnawed at me. Every time I went to town for parts, I saw his new trucks, his new grain bins going up. People were talking. Clayton Vance was a visionary. Jed Miller was a stubborn fool, too proud to change. They saw my faded farmall and my leaking John Deere 720, and they saw a man falling behind. What they didn't see was my ledger book, with its neat columns of black ink and not a drop of red. The problem was, Vance had a point about horsepower. My quarter section was good land, but I had a 40-acre patch of heavy clay on the back side that the old two-cylinder 720 struggled with, especially in a wet spring. It could pull the four-bottom plough, but it was a slow, gut-straining process. I needed more traction, more power, but I wasn't about to walk into the PCA office with my hat in my hand and sign my name on a $30,000 loan for a new four-wheel drive. That was a sucker's bet. The idea came to me one Saturday in February, while I was rummaging through Old Man Hemlock's scrapyard, looking for a hydraulic cylinder for my loader. Hemlock's place was a graveyard of forgotten iron, acres of rusting tractors, combines and implements sinking slowly back into the earth. It was a place most people avoided, but for me, it was a library of mechanical history. And there it was, tucked away behind a mountain of scrap iron and overgrown with wild grapevines. I saw a shape I recognized. It was big, articulated in the middle. 4 massive, weather-cracked tires, all flat. It was an early Steiger, one of the barn-built models from the early 60s before they became a big company. A Steiger Wildcat, I figured. It was painted a hideous industrial green, but most of that had been scoured off by years of sun and snow, revealing a patina of deep, honest rust. I pushed through the thorns and laid a hand on its massive fender. The steel was cold and solid. The cab was just a rudimentary cage with some canvas flaps for doors, most of which had rotted away. The glass was gone. The seat was a mess of rusted springs and mouse-chewed foam. But the frame was massive. The axles were planetary, heavy-duty. The articulation joint looked like it belonged on a piece of mining equipment. This thing was built for one purpose: to pull. Old Man Hemlock shuffled out of his shed, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. "What are you looking at that old monster for, Jed? That thing ain't run in 15 years. Farmer over in Pike County bought it new, tried to pull a 7-bottom plow with it. Threw a rod clean through the side of the block. He hauled it here for scrap and bought a new Versatile." "What kind of engine was in it?" I asked, my mind already turning. "Detroit diesel," Hemlock spat, as if the name tasted bad. "A 6V71. Screamin', Jimmy. Loudest damn thing you ever heard. Parts are a nightmare to find." I walked around to the side and peered into the engine bay. He was right. There was a fist-sized hole in the side of the engine block, a jagged, ugly wound of shattered cast iron. It was dead. Utterly and completely dead. Most men would have walked away, but I saw something else. I saw potential. I saw a frame and a drivetrain that were massively overbuilt. The engine was scrap, but the heart of the tractor, the steel that gave it strength, was still good. "What do you want for it, scrap price?" I asked. Hemlock squinted at me. "You ain't thinking of fixing that thing, are you? You're crazier than I thought." "Just give me a price," I said. He did some figuring in his head, scratched his beard, and named a number. It was more than scrap, but less than a used riding lawnmower. I had the cash in my truck. I paid him on the spot. The next Saturday, I came back with my friend Earl and his flatbed winch truck. Getting that Steiger out of the fence row was a job for the ages. We had to cut down 3 trees, winch it through a foot of mud, and replace 2 of the rotted tires with used ones from Hemlock's pile that would at least hold air long enough to get it home. When we finally dragged the rusty green monster into my yard, it looked even worse than it had at the junkyard. It sat there, listing to one side, a monument to failure. My wife, Sarah, came out on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She took one look at it and just shook her head, but she didn't say a word. She knew that look in my eye. Vance drove by that afternoon. He slowed his Lincoln to a crawl, rolled down the power window, and just stared. He had a smirk on his face that said it all. The crazy old dinosaur was bringing home junk now. He shook his head and sped off, probably racing to the coffee shop to tell everyone. Let him talk, I thought. The first order of business was getting the dead Detroit out. It was a greasy, back-breaking job. I used my Farmolem with its loader and a heavy chain. The engine weighed over a ton. After 2 days of wrestling with rusted bolts and hoses that were hard as rock, I finally hoisted the shattered block free. It swung in the air, dripping ancient black oil onto the ground, and I lowered it onto a pallet. Now I had a tractor with a giant empty hole in it. The question was what to put in its place. A new Detroit was out of the question. Too expensive, too complicated. I needed something simple, powerful, and cheap. Something I knew. The answer was sitting in another corner of Hemlock's yard. It was an old International Harvester, TD-18 bulldozer, half swallowed by the earth. The tracks were seized, the blade was bent, but under the hood was an International UD-18A diesel engine. It was a big, slow-turning 6-cylinder that started on gasoline and then switched over to diesel. They were legendary engines, known for their torque and their absolute refusal to die. I'd run one for a summer job years ago. I knew its sound, its feel. I bought that too for little more than a song. Now the real work began. The project consumed my winter. Every day, after morning chores, I was in the machine shed. The shed was cold, the only heat coming from a pot-belly stove in the corner. My breath plumed in the air as I worked. First, I had to get the UD-18A running. I tore it down, cleaned decades of grime off every part, honed the cylinders, checked the bearings, and put it all back together with new gaskets I cut myself from sheets of cork. Then came the fabrication. The International engine had a completely different mounting system than the Detroit. I spent a week with a cutting torch, a welder, and a stack of half-inch steel plate, building new motor mounts. I had to fabricate a new bell housing adapter to connect the engine to the Steiger's massive 10-speed transmission. I taught myself to use my father's old metal lathe, turning a new pilot bushing out of a chunk of brass. My hands were perpetually stained with grease and dotted with cuts and burns from the welder. Vance and his friends at the coffee shop were having a grand old time at my expense. The story was that Jed Miller had finally lost his mind. He was trying to build a tractor out of 2 different pieces of junk. Franken tractor, they called it. They'd drive by my place on Sunday afternoons just to see the monstrosity sitting in my yard. I ignored them. I kept my head down and my torch lit. Finally, in late March, with the frost just starting to leave the ground, it was time. I'd connected the fuel lines, bled the injectors, and hooked up a temporary wiring harness. I filled the little gasoline starting tank, set the levers, and hit the starter. The starting motor whirred. The engine coughed on gasoline, sputtering and backfiring. Then I threw the big compression release lever. With a great belch of black smoke, the diesel cylinders caught. The engine settled into a low, loping idle. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't the high-pitched scream of the old Detroit. This was a deep, guttural heartbeat. The sound of pure, raw torque. The whole machine shed seemed to vibrate with it. I stood back, a slow grin spreading across my face. It was alive. The early 1970s had been good years for farmers. The Russians were buying grain, prices were strong, and the government was telling us to plant fence-row to fence-row. It was a heady time, a time of seemingly endless optimism. Land values were soaring. A man could go to the bank on Monday, get a loan for a new tractor, and by Friday, the rising value of his land had already paid for half of it, at least on paper. It was a paper boom, and Clayton Vance was its king. By the spring of '77, Vance had expanded to nearly 2,000 acres. He'd torn down old barns, bulldozed fence rows, and tiled every low spot. His operation was a showcase of modern efficiency. He had a brand new John Deere 8630, the biggest 4-wheel drive Deere made, with duals on all 4 wheels. He had a new 24-row planter and a Gleaner N7 combine that could swallow a field of corn in an afternoon. He was making money hand over fist, and he wasn't shy about it. His wife drove a new Cadillac, and he was building a new brick house on a hill overlooking the land he'd bought from Frank Henderson. Meanwhile, I was finishing my Franken tractor. I gave it a coat of paint, not the original Steiger green, but a simple, tough coat of International Harvester red to honor the engine that was its new heart. I put new glass in the cab, a new seat I salvaged from a wrecked truck, and hooked up a pair of simple headlights. It was ugly. The lines didn't quite match. The long, red hood of the International engine looked awkward, grafted onto the green Steiger chassis. But it was mine. Every bolt, every weld, every drop of sweat was mine, and it owed no man a thing. The first time I took it to the field was a day I'll never forget. I hooked it up to my old 5-bottom Oliver plough, a plough my 720 could barely manage in the heavy clay. I throttled up the big UD-18A. The deep thump of the engine settled into a powerful roar, and the 10-foot-tall exhaust stack I'd fabricated began to puff a steady rhythm of black smoke. I dropped the plough into the ground. The tractor didn't even grunt. It just leaned into the harness, all 4 massive tires biting into the earth, and walked away with that plough like it wasn't even there. The furrows rolled over, black and clean. I was ploughing deeper and faster than I ever had before. I finished that tough 40-acre patch in a single day, a job that used to take me the better part of a week. Word got around. A few of the smaller farmers, guys who were struggling to keep up but were too proud or too smart to go into debt like Vance, started stopping by. Old man Peterson, who farmed 80 acres of hills with an ancient Farmall 400, asked if I'd be willing to do some custom ploughing for him. His tractor just couldn't handle the tough spots anymore. That's how it started. I ploughed Peterson's ground. Then I did some dissing for the Miller brothers down the road. My price was fair, cash on the barrelhead. The big red tractor became a common sight in the county. It wasn't pretty, but it was powerful and reliable. The old-timers who remembered the sound of those International crawlers would stop and watch, a nostalgic look in their eyes. They understood. They knew the difference between iron that was built to last and plastic that was built to be traded in. Vance saw it, of course. He'd fly by in his pickup, a cloud of dust in his wake, never acknowledging me. To him, my custom work was small time, a pittance. While I was making a few $100 ploughing a neighbor's field, he was closing deals on another quarter section of land. In his eyes, and in the eyes of the bank and the coffee shop crowd, he was winning. I was just a stubborn old fool playing with his toys. I didn't care. I was working my own land better than ever before, and the custom work brought in extra cash. Good, honest, debt-free cash. I put it in the bank. I didn't build a new house. I didn't buy a new truck. Sarah and I kept living in the same simple farmhouse my parents had lived in. We patched the roof when it leaked and put a new coat of paint on the porch. We were saving. For what, I wasn't entirely sure. I just had a feeling, a deep-seated caution passed down from my father, who had lived through the 30s. He always said, "Son, the fat times never last. Always keep something back for the lean." The fat times rolled on. The late 70s were a blur of high prices and easy credit. Interest rates started to creep up, but nobody seemed to notice. The talk was of inflation, how it made debt cheaper. "You're paying back loans with cheaper dollars," the farm magazines said. "Borrow all you can." It was a siren song, and most farmers were steering their ships straight for the rocks. One afternoon in the fall of '79, I was at the co-op getting a load of fertilizer. Vance was there, holding court by the office, laughing with the manager. He was talking about the new combine he'd just ordered, a John Deere 8820, a $250,000 machine. He saw me and strolled over, his confidence radiating off him like heat from a furnace. "Still running that old junkyard dog, Jed?" he asked, loud enough for the others to hear. "She runs good," I said quietly. "Yeah, well, my 8630 is getting a little long in the tooth. 2 years old, you know," he said, with a wink to the manager. "Thinking of trading up to one of the new Steiger Tigers, over 500 horsepower. A man needs the right tools for the job if he wants to be a professional." He was baiting me, but I didn't bite. I just nodded and signed my ticket. As I walked away, I heard him say to the manager, "Some people just don't have the vision. He'll still be sitting on his little quarter section when my boy takes over the whole county." I climbed into my old pickup and drove home. The leaves were turning, painting the hills in brilliant shades of red and gold. The harvest was looking good, another bin buster. Everything on the surface looked perfect, prosperous, but my father's words echoed in my mind. The fat times never last. And as I looked out over the rolling fields, I couldn't shake the feeling that a long, cold winter was coming. A winter that would test the difference between a foundation of steel and a foundation of paper. The change, when it came, wasn't a slow erosion. It was a thunderclap on a clear day. The year turned to 1980. We were putting seed in the ground, the soil was warming up, and the talk at the co-op was all about the price of corn hitting $4 a bushel by fall. Then the news came over the radio, crackling from the speaker in my old pickup. President Carter had announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. Just like that, the biggest buyer in the world was gone. The market panicked. Prices on the Chicago Board of Trade didn't just drop, they fell off a cliff. The $4 corn we'd all been promised became $2 corn overnight. A man's entire year, his profit margin, his ability to pay his operating loan, was cut in half by a voice on the radio speaking about events in a country half a world away. That summer, the sky turned against us too. The rain simply stopped. The sun beat down with a merciless, white-hot intensity. Corn leaves curled up tight like little green cigars, trying to save what moisture they had. The ground cracked open in patterns that looked like a dry riverbed. Clayton Vance's 2,000 acres, much of it sandy loam that needed constant moisture, began to burn up. His massive center-pivot irrigation systems, which I'd seen him install for a fortune, ran day and night. But they were a losing battle. He was pumping expensive diesel fuel to fight a losing war against the sky. My own land, with its heavier soil, held the moisture better. My yields would be down, but the crop wasn't dying. Not yet. The first real sign of trouble for Vance came during harvest. The drought had weakened the corn stalks, and a windstorm in early September laid whole sections of his fields flat. Harvesting downed corn is a slow, brutal, machine-eating job. You have to crawl, the combine head chewing on dirt and rocks as much as corn. I was out in my own field on my old Gleaner F, working my way through a decent stand of beans, when I saw the plume of smoke. It was coming from Vance's place, over the hill. It wasn't the clean black smoke of a working diesel. It was thick, white, and oily. I finished my pass, shut down the combine, and drove the pickup over to see. There it was, his magnificent John Deere 8820, the pride of the county, sitting dead in the middle of a row. The side shields were open, and Vance and his hired man were staring into a mess of hydraulic lines and wiring. A fine mist of hydraulic fluid coated the entire side of the machine, shimmering in the sun. "What's the trouble, Clayton?" I asked, pulling up alongside. He didn't look at me at first. He just kicked one of the massive tires. His face, usually so confident, was tight with frustration. "Hydraulic pump on the main variable speed drive went out," he snapped. "Took the whole damn electronic controller with it. It's a $5,000 part, and the dealer in town doesn't have one. Said it might be a week to get it from Moline. A week, in the middle of harvest, a week is a lifetime. Every day that corn stayed in the field, it got drier, the stalks got weaker, and more of it fell to the ground, lost forever. "Can't you bypass it?" I asked. "Bypass it?" He finally looked at me, his eyes filled with a kind of weary contempt. "Jed, this isn't one of your old junkers. You can't just fix it with a wrench and a piece of baling wire. The whole thing is run by a computer. Without that controller, it's just a $250,000 paperweight." He was right. His machine was a marvel of technology, but that technology was a black box. When it failed, he was completely helpless. A captain stranded on a ship he didn't know how to sail, waiting for a specialist to be flown in from a distant port. I nodded. "Well, hope you get it running soon." I turned the truck around and left him there, standing in the dust next to his silent, green behemoth. A few days later, I was chugging along in my old red Steiger, pulling my disc through a field I'd just combined. The big International diesel settled into its familiar, low-frequency rhythm, a sound that vibrated right through the soles of my boots. I looked over the valley at Vance's land. A big flatbed truck from the John Deere dealership was finally hauling his combine away. He'd lost nearly 10 days of perfect harvesting weather, 10 days of his crop lying on the ground. The cracks in his empire were beginning to show. He'd always traded equipment every 2 years, but that fall, the old 2-year-old combine wasn't replaced with a new one. He had to make the payments on the broken one first. The coffee shop talk started to change. It was no longer about Vance's genius. Now, it was hushed whispers about how much he owed, how much the drought had hurt his yields, how he was leveraged to the absolute limit. The same men who had praised his vision were now shaking their heads and saying he'd flown too close to the sun. His confidence, once a blazing fire, had been reduced to a bed of nervous coals. The easy credit that had fueled his rise was about to become the anchor that would drag him to the bottom. The winter of 1981 was when the other shoe dropped. The government, in its infinite wisdom, decided the only way to kill the raging inflation of the 70s was with brutal, punishing interest rates. A man named Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve cranked the prime rate up to 21%. 21%. It was a number so impossibly high it didn't seem real. For me, it was an inconvenience. The interest on my savings account at the local bank went up, which was nice. But for Clayton Vance, and thousands of farmers like him, it was a death sentence. His loans from the Production Credit Association weren't fixed. They were variable rate loans tied to the prime. Almost overnight, the interest on his massive debt more than doubled. The payments that were once manageable became monstrous. He was caught in a perfect storm. The value of his land, which was the collateral for all his loans, was plummeting. The price of his crops was in the gutter, and the cost of the money he had borrowed to buy all of it was now astronomical. He was being squeezed from all sides. That spring you could feel the desperation in the air. There were more farm auctions, more moving sales. Good men, men who had farmed their whole lives, were being forced out. Vance held on. He sold off a few parcels of land he'd bought at the peak of the market, taking a huge loss just to raise cash. He let his hired man go. He and his wife and their teenage son tried to run the whole 2,000-acre operation themselves. You'd see the lights on his tractors in the fields late into the night. He was working himself to the bone, trying to outrun the interest clock. But you can't outrun 21%. I saw him at the parts store one day in May. He was trying to buy an injector pump for his big 8630 tractor. He looked 10 years older. His face was gaunt, his eyes were hollow, and his manicured hands were now calloused and stained with grease. He put the part on the counter, and the clerk ran the bill. Vance pulled out his checkbook, but then hesitated. Can you put this on my account?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The clerk, a young man who had probably once looked at Vance with awe, now looked uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, Mr. Vance. My boss said, we have to go cash only on all accounts over 30 days past due." The color drained from Vance's face. He stood there for a long moment, the checkbook still open in his hand. The other farmers in the store suddenly found something fascinating to look at on the floor. The silence was deafening. Finally, without a word, Vance turned and walked out, leaving the expensive part on the counter. I paid for my own parts, a couple of hydraulic hoses and a set of filters, with cash from the roll I kept in my pocket. As I left, I saw him sitting in his Lincoln, which was now dusty and had a dent in the fender. He was just staring straight ahead through the windshield, seeing nothing. The king was a prisoner in his own castle, unable to even buy the parts to keep it running. By the fall of 1982, it was over. The foreclosure notices went up in the county paper. The Production Credit Association, the same institution that had financed his dream, was now presiding over its funeral. Another auction was scheduled. Another farm, a bigger one this time, was about to be erased from the map. I survived. It wasn't easy. The low prices hurt everyone. But my costs were a fraction of Vance's. My fuel bill was high, but I wasn't paying for a new combine. My repair bills were there, but I was buying bearings and seals, not $5,000 electronic controllers. And most importantly, I had no debt. The 21% interest that was a guillotine for Vance was just a number in the newspaper to me. My big red tractor was my salvation. It ran day in and day out, pulling the plow, the disc, the planter. When my neighbor's new Case 4-wheel drive went down with a transmission failure, I finished his planting for him. The cash from that custom work bought my seed for the year. I was a dinosaur, all right. And it turned out, in the midst of the financial ice age, the dinosaurs were the only ones tough enough to survive. I wasn't getting rich. I was just holding on, my feet planted firmly on land that was mine, powered by iron that I owned. In the farm crisis of the 1980s, that was the only kind of wealth that mattered. The day of Vance's auction was a mirror image of Frank Henderson's 6 years earlier. It was the same crisp autumn air, the same grim-faced crowd of farmers shuffling their feet in the gravel. But the mood was different. There was no sense of opportunity here, no vultures circling. There was only a profound, shared sadness. Everyone knew it could have been them. For many, it still might be. The same auctioneer, Peterson, was there, but his slick, confident chant had a hollow ring to it now. He knew this crowd had no money. The only real bidders were the bankers and the insurance companies, there to protect their investments and pick up land for pennies on the dollar. Clayton Vance stood by the porch of the big brick house he had built, the house that was supposed to be the seat of his dynasty. He looked like a ghost. His wife stood beside him, her face a mask of quiet grief. He had lost everything. The 2,000 acres, the fleet of shiny green machinery, the grain bins, the whole empire. It had all been built on a foundation of borrowed paper, and the first strong wind had blown it all away. They sold the equipment first. The magnificent John Deere 88-entry combine, the one that had sat broken in the field, sold for less than half of what he owed on it. The big 80LCX30 tractor, his pride and joy, went for a fraction of its value. The market was flooded. There were a dozen auctions just like this one in a 50-mile radius. Good equipment was selling for scrap prices. I watched, my arms crossed, standing in the back just as I had before. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction. I just saw the terrible, predictable end of a tragedy. Vance caught my eye once. There was no arrogance left in his gaze, no mockery, only a deep, bottomless exhaustion. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement of a truth he had refused to see for too long. Finally, the auctioneer moved to the land. They sold it off in parcels. 160 acres here, 80 there. The out-of-state land companies bought most of it, their agents on the phone bidding with cold, emotionless precision. They were buying cheap, planning to rent it out or let it sit until the market recovered. Then came the last parcel. 80 acres. The home place, it was called. It included the new brick house, the barns, the machine shed. The heart of it all. Peterson started the bidding. All right, folks, here it is. The homestead. 80 acres of prime ground with a fine, modern home. Who will start me at $1,000 an acre? Silence. $1,000 an acre was a fortune now. Land values had collapsed that much. 900 then? Do I hear 900? A man from the bank raised his finger. He was there to make sure the property didn't sell for nothing. I have 900. Who'll give 950? The silence stretched on. Vance's wife closed her eyes. This was the final blow. Losing the house. Being forced to pack up their belongings and leave the community. Disgraced. I thought of my father. I thought of his words. The fat times never last. And I thought of something else he used to say. A man's only as good as the kindness he shows when he has the upper hand. I took a breath and raised my hand. 950! The auctioneer barked, his eyes lighting up. I've got 950 from Jed Miller. Now 1,000. Do I hear 1,000? The banker looked over at me. He knew my farm was paid for. He knew I had cash. He gave a slight shake of his head to his colleague. They were not going to get into a bidding war with me. Their job was just to set a floor, not to buy the property back. Sold! Peterson's gavel cracked through the air. For $950 an acre to Jedediah Miller. A murmur went through the crowd. I didn't look at anyone. I just walked toward the clerk's table to sign the papers. As I passed Clayton Vance, he reached out and put a hand on my arm. Jed. Why? He asked, his voice thick with emotion. It's good land, I said simply. You know what I mean, he said. You could have let the bank take it. You could have bought it for less. I stopped and looked at him, really looked at him. Your boy plays baseball with my nephew, I said. It's hard to play ball when you have to move 100 miles away. I'll need a renter for the house. The rent will be fair, and I'll need someone to look after the ground. We can talk about a crop share lease when you're ready. Tears welled up in his eyes. He tried to speak, but no words came out. He just squeezed my arm, a gesture of gratitude that said more than 1,000 words. He had lost his empire, but I had just given him a chance to keep his home, to keep his dignity. The coffee shop talk changed for good after that day. I was no longer Jed the dinosaur. I was Jed Miller, the man who saw the storm coming, the man who survived, the man who, when he had the chance to crush his rival, chose to offer a hand instead. My reputation was no longer built on the faded red paint of my tractor, but on the strength of my character. Years passed. The farm crisis slowly eased. Prices recovered, but the lessons were burned into the soul of our community. The go-go days of debt and expansion were over, replaced by a hard-won caution. Clayton Vance never farmed on a grand scale again. He worked the 80 acres I rented to him, and he took a job in town driving a truck for the co-op. He was humbled, but he wasn't broken. We became, not friends exactly, but something close to it. A quiet respect grew between us. We'd nod to each other in town, and sometimes we'd stand by our pickups and talk about the weather or the price of beans. The past was never mentioned. It didn't need to be. One cool Saturday afternoon in the early 90s, my grandson, Ben, was with me in the machine shed. He was 12 years old, with the same curiosity for mechanical things that I'd had at his age. I was doing a tune-up on the old red Steiger. After all those years, it was still my main tillage tractor. Its red paint was chipped and faded, its massive tires worn smooth, but the heart of it, that old International engine, still beat with a slow, steady rhythm. "Grandpa," Ben asked, handing me a wrench, "why do we still use this old thing? Dad said we could afford one of those new green ones with a computer and air conditioning." I stopped what I was doing and wiped my greasy hands on a rag. I looked at the boy and then at the tractor. "Ben," I said, "this tractor is more than just iron. It's a lesson. See, those new tractors, they're fine machines, but you don't own them, not really. The bank owns them. The company that makes the computer inside owns them. When they break, you're helpless. You have to call a man with a laptop to fix them, and he sends you a bill that would choke a horse." I patted the big steel fender of the Steiger. "This one. We own this one. Every bolt, every wire. When it breaks, you and I, we fix it. Right here, with these." I held up my calloused hands. "It doesn't owe a dime to anyone. It represents freedom. The freedom from being told what you are worth by a man in a suit. It taught me that you don't build a life on what you can borrow. You build it on what you can make, what you can save, and what you can fix with your own 2 hands. I fired up the old engine. It coughed to life with a familiar puff of black smoke, then settled into its deep, rumbling idle. The sound echoed in the shed, a sound of resilience, of survival. It was the sound of my father's wisdom and my own hard-won experience. I looked out the open doors of the shed, across my fields, toward the hill where Clayton Vance still lived in his brick house. The land was green and healthy. The community was scarred but healing. We had made it through the fire. I let Ben take the driver's seat, and I stood on the step beside him as we rumbled out into the yard. The setting sun cast a long shadow of the old tractor across the ground it had worked for so many years. It wasn't a pretty machine, and it certainly wasn't new, but it was ours. And it was proof that sometimes the future isn't about horsepower and volume. It's about having the wisdom to hold on to the things that are truly paid for.